Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'm Justin Baca. I'm here to discuss Azure Government governance and cost management techniques. I'm going to use some of the past experiences that we've had in Azure Government, more from a DoD side, but just a little background of who I am. I spent 10 and a half years in the Marine Corps on active duty doing IT with basically whatever you could find, just because they didn't have the funding to get us the high-tech stuff. After that, I started doing a lot of IT consulting, and then I went to work for AIS in a lot of the Azure cloud spaces, doing a lot of DevOps engineering, in addition to development, architecture, and all of the above. So I'm glad to be here tonight. Hopefully you get some value out of this presentation. So cloud governance, what is it, right? Who's doing it? Are you doing it today in your own cloud journey? So what I'm saying by that is it a culture that you've adopted right now today as you migrate applications into the cloud? Sometimes we move so fast and we're under such tight budgets that we don't necessarily consider governance as one of those key precursors to actually doing things into the government or into Azure. Structures. Do we know who these people in offices are? Do we know who to reach out to give us the good direction and guidance as to what we need to implement? The do's and the don'ts, right? What's guiding those do's and the don'ts? Usually those are principles that have been established by those structures, such as when I'm going into the cloud, do I want a zero trust policy when I'm talking about applications? Should these applications not interact with other applications unless they meet certain security requirements? For example, maybe the only way to talk to an application is over port 443 via CAC authentication, right? Or do we want to allow these interconnectivity between applications over most common ports, if it's a directory server or something like that, just things to think about. In addition to other principles is, what's the theme? Have we established what we're doing with these applications as they move into the cloud? Are we saying you need to target SaaS first? Let's look at how we can refactor or optimize your application as we move in and make it a SaaS, PaaS, and then an IaaS consideration. Is lift and shift the first response? Depending on how the cost management decision works. All right, and what's really driving this on the Azure side? Technology, right? The technology is giving us the value. That's the value add. It's enabling the business to accomplish their vision, their mission, and their goals. And Azure has an abundance of it. But to get the highest value out of the technology, we want to be able to put controls around that. And those controls are the rules of the road, those policies of the do's and the don'ts. And those controls, make sure I don't step off this platform, are what are going to protect that organization to ensure there's no misuse of the platform, and also to ensure that operations run smoothly throughout the day when that application is running by the ONS team and whatnot. And having an automated governance plan that enforces those controls is what's going to give us the protection we need to enable that value so that we can deliver quicker on our application goals. Some governance building blocks. Jerry had already spoken about quite a few of these. But these are very important topics that we need to consider as we're moving in. And getting an understanding of what these actually do for you as you start moving these applications and doing some architecture and designing around Azure. Role-based access control, that's a huge core service. Even when you create your account, you have to have an account that's represented as a user principal that has some sort of access, right? Tenants being the top-level enterprise or organizational security boundary. That's where you establish that Azure Active Directory. Management groups, as we discussed earlier, that logical grouping of resources, facilitating subscription governance and compliance, as he demonstrated. On the subscriptions, we can apply policies and initiatives, right? Policies are usually like a single set of rules that we want to follow, whereas initiatives can be combination or a set of those policies. You can combine policies into initiatives. Resource groups, not going to go too into the weeds on what all these are, but resource groups, of course, you can apply RBAC to. Resources being that smallest unit of deployable artifacts into the Azure space there. But you can still apply RBAC and locks, as we demonstrated before, on those resources. Blueprints, as he demonstrated. Cost controls, using those different utilities, right? Azure Advisor, cost management and billing, Azure Monitor. And then what brings that all together, right? The automation piece. The automation is what builds or takes all these building blocks, puts them together to give us that governance plan and that automation for cloud governance. So Jerry spoke on naming convention in his management group policy. Now, I put this slide here because this is something that we use today on a specific client in the DoD. And what I want to highlight about this is if you don't do this early on in your cloud adoption journey, you're going to have a lot of issues. There are certain limitations and requirements when you're talking about naming conventions, right? Some things are I'll get into it here in a little bit, but you want to start naming things. On the next slide, I'll talk about it more. But you want to start naming your tenant, making sure that you have a good name for your tenant. Custom domain names. Is one tenant going to talk to another? Who's registering those DNS addresses? Are they going to conflict from a enterprise-wide? Especially when you're dealing with a Gov or .mil and things of that nature. But you want to establish a naming convention that can be used and be consistent across multiple, I would say, areas within Azure. So subscriptions, management groups, resource groups. And are you going to use the same naming convention for each one of those items, those logical groupings? As you see here, I have just a demonstrated naming convention where we use something like, cloud service provider, enterprise, department, account, business, a little environment variable here, a security, if you have a security acronym, the actual application name, and then maybe you have a versioning on that application, which is like an ordinal. But what I want to talk about really is just some of the constraints and the limitations on these naming conventions, right? On the scoping, do we know if there's a global requirement that name of that resource to be unique? Something like a storage account, right? So let's say I'm developing in my lab, and then I go and try to deploy that same template in my production environment. I'm going to get an error that says this storage account already exists, right? So we want to make sure that we identify those limitations and those constraints up front. And some of those may be character limitations and whatnot. I'm not going to go too far down the weeds on here. But then we consider tags. Do we want to use tags as a duplicative of what our naming convention is? Should the tag have the same thing our naming convention has? Or should the tags provide value? Or do we not care about our naming convention and we're going to use our tags instead as more of a naming convention? There's a limitation on tags too, right? We can only have a certain number of tags. So it's really up to the government or to the organization to identify what those requirements are so that those developers that are building these blueprints or these deployable artifacts, such as the ARM templates, have a route forward. Architecture and design, right? Going back to that principle. Are we targeting SaaS, PaaS, then IaaS? Are we going to utilize native marketplace images? Do we want to bring our own from a governance perspective? Are we going to use that gold disk to stamp out an image and bring that into the cloud space and try to deploy that? Or can we use things like desired state configuration, right? Which requires me not to have any customized image. I take a marketplace image, I put some desired state configuration against it, bam, STIG compliant. Hybrid. Are we going to, what are the considerations as far as express route connections? Interconnectivity between mission applications, virtual networks. Do I want one or more applications to have virtual network interconnectivity? Isolation of the application, we talked about this before. Zero trust. And those security control requirements. Are they all under the same ATO? Or is each application, department, subscription under their own ATO boundary and they're just inheriting controls? Those are things that we need to consider as we move in. On the subscription management piece, again, we have RBAC, management groups, initiatives and policies, blueprints, and resource providers. That's one thing we haven't talked about yet, and I'll get into it a little more. But subscription management is crucial as part of the governance plan. I did want to highlight here on the resource provisioning. As part of that governance, we need to understand where resources are actually available to be deployed to. Not necessarily is it against our governance policy, but can we even use that resource like the OMS workspaces, log analytics, right? It's only in Azure Gov of Virginia. So if I want to use it in a DoD region, I need to understand that it's only available in Azure Government, Virginia. Am I going to have a secondary and a primary region? He showed a little bit of this earlier, Jerry did, but just a real quick code snippet of something that we're doing today on a DoD client on how I can take an actual deny statement for a subset of allowed resources and put that into a small variable and use that as a deployable item. I can build things on the fly. Again, this is all driven by like PowerShell, still in a JSON format, but I can submit that as a deployable artifact in one of my pipelines. So what I'm saying here is I don't want you to deploy public with IP addresses into my cloud space. I'm not trying to give external access into my cloud space. I don't want you deploying virtual networks that I've already set and blueprinted for you. I don't want you to peer your network with another network, right? We're going to disallow that. And then maybe we have a naming convention or some sort of role-based access control that we're applying on our resource groups. So I don't want you to go out and provision a resource group because maybe you don't have the ability to, as an owner on that resource group or that subscription. For an example, one of our clients, we don't allow them to put any kind of RBAC on their resources. RBAC is always inherited down. So the RBAC responsibility is at that DevOps engineering team that's managing the entire cloud space. Resource providers. So we can limit the actual type of resources that are even allowed to be deployed. I mean, not even just from let's say somebody flipped a bit in your policy and they did allow, let's just say, a virtual network to be deployed. Well, what if I don't even allow it from a resource provider perspective? No matter what, they wouldn't even be able to deploy it. I'm highlighting here the bot service, but I can do it, if there's certain services I know, like let's say I don't want mission applications to use dev test labs, right? I can deny it here, and there's no possibility of them ever even getting it deployed. Automation. Some of the government's items, and Jerry had already hit on the number here, but change management. Integrating your DevOps pipelines with change management, getting those reviews, successful builds, and the approvals, right? ARM templates, enforcing that standardization and naming convention, and then utilizing runbooks, right? As part of that automated governance plan, we can use runbooks as a proactive measure to trigger some proactive action, to do something on schedule, or just to alert me. I'm highlighting here security practices, desired state configuration, a huge governance tool that we use today in our DoD environments. There's a community-driven resource behind this, but it's encouraged that developers go out and they learn it on their own as well. It works on both Linux and Windows, and it's something that you can utilize to provide that STIG compliance. So back to my couple slides ago, taking a virtual machine, marketplace image, doesn't matter, combining that with a desired state configuration, and there's no necessary need for having these gold STIG images that you maintain in a repository that are outdated every time you do a patch update. Security Center, we hit on that already. But getting that, the visibility for audit and compliance, being able to, if you're one of those security gurus, doing hunting and log analytics. If you're a hunter and you're in there and you're supporting an offensive, defensive team, DCO, and then understanding, where traffic is actually originating from. Let's say it's originating from like North Korea or somewhere. Security Center can provide those highlights to you. All right, switching topics, cost management. He already had the circle of life here. Again, cost management is an iteration. It starts at that application and migration analysis, right? When you're looking at those applications to be on this cloud journey, we need to consider things like reserved instances. If we know it's going to be a lift and shift, and we know this application is going to be out there for more than 3 years, why not leverage an extended contract at a reduced cost and get the value of that? Does your organization already have SQL licenses? You can utilize those same SQL licenses on the Azure SQL images. Why not utilize things you've already paid for? And then, identifying the appropriate SKUs. There's tools out there that you can use to identify the appropriate SKUs, or Azure Migrate is a tool that you can utilize to kind of compare what you have on your premise to what you can actually migrate that to in the cloud. Baselining applications and resources. Establishing that normal running performance rate, right? Getting those metrics. Knowing what that looks like. And then doing the reviews, monthly, quarterly, annually, to see what those normal running values are. And then communicating with the operations and sustainment team. Getting those folks involved. They're the ones that are there looking at the application, the runtime, the CPU, the memory. And then establishing a modernization roadmap. Maybe that first sprint or that first phase of the application is bringing it into the Azure space. Next phase is how do we microservice that application and saving costs at the same time. So what I have here is just a couple cost management tools: Azure Cost Management and Billing, Azure Monitor, Azure Advisor. And maybe those tools don't give you everything you need because you're under, let's say, the CSP model. You're not under the EA model. Well, the cost management and billing utility does not currently work with, I believe it does not currently work with the CSP model. So maybe you want to use something like a cloud check or a third-party tool to kind of bring out that data. I'm not saying that's the tool of choice. I'm just saying there's options out there for you to get the type of insight that you need. This graph right here is a real live graph of a scenario where we started developing and deploying resources into Azure. We hit a high point. We understood our baseline. We were nowhere near utilizing the capacity of the resources we needed, and a huge bell curve, and we flatlined. So we were able to change the SKU of our resources, and we saved 2/3 of the cost by doing so. So doing that normalization on those applications is key. All right, time for my demo. I don't know if that was too fast, but we're going to make it happen. All right, well, let me go back just one. So what I have here, I have a demonstration of automating the start and stop of a virtual machine using a custom module, an Azure runbook, a schedule, which, if this was a service that you knew you could do this on schedule, could potentially, depending on the number of hours you want it down, could save you, in this particular instance, 1/3 the cost of that compute resource. I'm shutting it down for about 8 hours a day through non-peak hours, but here we go. So here I'm using the Azure Automation account. In that automation account, we have modules. This was a module that I built. I used it for specific reasons. There's 2 of them. Runbook login, runbook virtual machine. You can see there's a couple functions. Well, this one has only one function. It just simplifies my login. I'm doing things to simplify my life. And then I have a couple get statements in here, and also a start-stop statement. And again, these were customized specifically to make my life a little bit easier. I publish them as modules, and I can utilize those in runbooks, which are just PowerShell scripts. And then I'm running these runbooks as workflows. I show you a quick view here. You can see that I took probably a 50-line runbook, and I made it into 10 by just making that module as simplified as I possibly could and calling those specific functions. So I'm just trying to make my life easier because my developers want to spend less time managing the platform and more time focusing on the application and delivering that value. Here I have 2 schedules. I'm starting with my start schedule. This right here, I'm saying that, I want this, let's just say it's a Bastion host or something like that, and I know I only need one to stay up all the time. But in the middle of the night, the other 4 can remain stopped. So I'm going to say that at, let's say 5 a.m. is a good time for these things to come back up. So I'm going to go ahead and set my 5 a.m. I did this on Monday, and at the end of this demo, I'm going to show you what the results of that was. So on Monday, I'm saying at 5 a.m. in the morning, let's go ahead and start that up. And I want to do that every day for an entire week. And what that allows me to do is that on schedule, that Start VM schedule will kick off the Start VM workflow runbook to start those virtual machines. And then at the same time, this one I could have sped this demo up just a little bit. But at the same time, I have a stop schedule. So what time do I want them to stop? Well, my developers, they normally work between, 9 to 5, but sometimes they like to work late at night, so I'll extend that out to, let's just say, 10 p.m. We'll give them a few hours if, overtime's gotten approved and whatnot to do some development on that project. So we're going to go ahead and say that, again, it's going to recur once a day, every day for an entire week, and I want it to stop at 10 p.m. And this is one optional way of doing this. I could have also created something like a logic app that gets triggered on an alert, and that logic app would actually do a webhook into a runbook to call this the same exact way in a more proactive measure. But here you can see I have both these schedules, one at 5 a.m., one at 10 p.m. I can see that they are running, and I can see the results of them being run by viewing the output in the jobs. And then with that being said, that should be the end of it. I'm going to show you what that looks like as it is today. This is the run book that ran. Am I not sharing this? Let me minimize. There we go. Let me go back one screen so you can see where I started. I have an easy-to-view dashboard here. I'm just going to go straight to that activity log. And you can see that since Monday, 2 days ago, I had them start, and if I highlight over that, they started right at around 5:03 Greenwich Mean Time. And then they also were deallocated. Deallocated does not mean delete. It just means it shut them down at 21:56. And I can do that on schedule for however long I need to, saving on those compute resources. And with that, that is all I have.